Hey everyone, so in this video I'm going to be talking about how much Python you should know before learning Django. And this is really an important topic for beginners. I find that a lot of beginners who dive straight into Django without any kind of good understanding of Python will normally struggle. And I was definitely like that. I started Django way too soon. I didn't have a very good foundational knowledge of Python, particularly the more advanced concepts like classes. And I really want to make it clear to beginners that if you are not very confident in your Python skills or just really not grasping Python, that diving into Django is not going to make it any easier. And what you might find is that you're struggling with Django, but a lot of the time the issues are not actually with Django, it's actually Python. So I want to cover in this video what the concepts are that I believe you should learn before starting with Django. And I'm going to reference a lot of blog posts that cover these concepts, and mainly those are coming from Real Python. They have a lot of good tutorials on the foundational knowledge of Python. And if you prefer a written version of this video, you can go to justdjango.com/blog and you'll see all of the written tutorials here. And if you go to how much Python should you know before learning Django, then you can read this exact video, but in a written format. So if you prefer this, then head over here. You can also find a whole bunch of other written tutorials. So with that being said, let's start with the video. So just before we start the tutorial, I just want to bring up learn.justdjango.com. The link is in the description of this video. It's a place where you can learn Django in a very structured way through a syllabus that I've put together over a long period of time. And it's really catered for either beginners that just want to get started with Django, or for people who really want to become professionals and use Django to build really wholesome production-ready applications. You can also try the first few hours for free in the basic Django roadmap, where you can get a sense of what Django is and just general web development fundamentals, and really get a sense of whether Django is for you. So check out learn.justdjango.com. Again, link is in the description. Thanks for listening, and we'll continue with the tutorial. So here I've got VS Code open, and I've created a blank Django project that I've got open here. And I'm just going to use this for reference to just give you an idea of how Python concepts are applied in Django and why it's so important to understand Python first before getting into Django. Of course, Django is built with Python, so it logically makes sense that you would need to have some understanding of Python, but I think sometimes we jump too soon into Django without understanding really the important bits of Python, especially the bits that make up Django and the parts that you will work a lot with in Django. So first, there are the basics, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create a file here just for keeping track of this. So I'll just call it concepts.txt. You don't need to follow along for this. Now, before writing these things out, I just want to make a quick disclaimer, which is that I'm not going to be covering the actual concepts. I'm not going to be teaching them in this video. There are a lot of tutorials, whether blog posts or videos, that you can find on YouTube, and I'll also reference most of these in the description of this video, that you can use to actually learn these concepts. This is more of a guide for people who want to start learning Django and they're not sure whether or not they know enough Python. So that being said, the first thing that I want to talk about are the basics. Now, the basics of Python are really, if we just list them out, variables and data types and conditional statements and for loops. Now, again, most of these are, because of the basics, I don't really need to explain this unless you really are a beginner. Then I would recommend starting out learning Python, because if you don't know at least what these are, then you really will struggle with Django. It's going to be throwing yourself in the deep end. So these, I mean, you can find lots of tutorials on variables, just storing data, data types being Boolean variables. So whether it's true or false, it could be strings, could be numbers, different types of data. It's important to understand the differences between those. Conditional statements, right? So if statements, if else, basic logic like that. And then for loops, so actually looping through some sort of object, like a list. So those are the basics, right? We need to have those in order to proceed in not only Python, but just general programming. And then once we've gone through those, then we start with iterables. Now, iterables are, for example, lists and tuples, right? They're objects that allow you to iterate through it using, for example, a for loop or while loop. These objects are essentially ways that we can actually loop through massive amounts of data. Now, in Django, so let me put you actually lists and tuples, right? Those are the Python objects that we work with that we normally iterate through. But in Django, we work with query sets most of the time. So a query set is, you could think of as a very fancy storage like a list, but it has a lot of other properties that allow us to create these complex mutations and filtering and comparisons. So query sets are a little bit more complicated than lists, but they behave in the same way because they're iterable. So that means that we can loop through a query set in the exact same way as we can loop through a list and a tuple. So if you are not familiar with lists and tuples and generally iterating through objects, then you're going to struggle with query sets. And as I said, that's not even the majority of the principles on a query set. That's just the concept of iterating through it. So make sure that you understand how to iterate through something. Number 3 is dictionaries. Now, dictionaries are also fairly simple to understand. It's a key value store of data. So we can create an object, and that object has a first name and a last name and an age, and we store all those values in the dictionary. These are normally quite simple to understand. Syntactically, it's not that difficult to remember, but what I would suggest is to understand methods on a dictionary. So methods like the .update method and the .pop method. Basically, .update allows you to update an existing dictionary, and then .pop allows you to remove a certain key from the dictionary. And these are just nice little helper methods that I think will come in handy if you understand really how to work with dictionaries, because you will work with them in Django, and I'll give some examples towards the end. Number 4 is functions, and this is really one of the most important concepts, not only in Python, but in programming in general. And you're going to use them in Django, of course, because there are a lot of places where you can use functions, like when you create views, or just in general, if you have a function that you want to calculate some sort of value that you then return on the front end. There's really infinite ways that you can use functions. So understanding how functions work is crucial. And most importantly, I think, is the concept of args and keyword args, or kwargs. Now, this is not really taught most of the time that I found in function core or just Python courses in general. So there is a link in the description to a real Python article that explains args and keyword args. There's a lot that I could go into in this, but it's very important because it basically allows you to pass in multiple arguments into a function. And why you need to learn this is because in Django, you'll see this a lot. And when I was starting with Django, I was seeing star args and double star keyword args, and I had no idea what that meant. And that just made things way more complicated because I thought it was a Django thing, and meanwhile it's not, it's a Python thing. So understanding this is going to be very important for you to understand how methods and functions work in Django. Right, so number 5 are decorators. Now, decorators, I would say, are not as widely used in Django. They are kind of used here and there, and it's kind of optional. It's not really something that you have to use, but they can be quite handy when you want to just add a quick decorator on your function that gives you extra functionality. And you'll see this in Django as well with the login required decorator. Now, you can always use the already existing decorators, and using a decorator is quite easy because you just have to say @ and then the name of the decorator. So for example, login required. But what's more important is to understand how to write them and how they work. So understanding how to actually write your own decorator is a lot more important. And I'm going to link something to Data Camp, which is another post that explains how to write decorators quite in depth. Number 6, which is the most important part that I want to focus on, are classes. Now, classes is a really huge section, and there are really hundreds of courses on the internet that explain how to write classes and all the paradigms of it. Now I'm just going to give you what I believe the most important concepts are to understand in classes that you're going to use in Django. So first, of course, you need to understand the syntax of writing a class, right? So when you're writing a class, you need to define the class keyword, give it a name, and just the general syntax of how you write it. You need to understand that inside and out and be able to write a class very easily. You need to understand the object-oriented programming paradigm. Now, this is a concept, object-oriented programming, and it doesn't exist only in Python. Some programming languages are more focused on OOP or designed around OOP than others. So it's just a concept you need to understand. Again, the articles that I list below will help a lot with this. The self keyword, right? So when we're writing classes in Python, we use self to refer to the actual instance of the class, whereas in JavaScript you would use the this keyword, right? So understanding what self does and just the concept behind self is very important. Then you're also going to want to understand the sort of special methods like the init method. And this is, I would say, probably the most important special method you need to understand, because all classes can have an init method that initializes the class with data that you provide it. And this is the same in Django. Every class in Django has an init method. Well, not everyone, but some of them have an init method that is required. And so that, again, is not a Django thing, it's a Python thing. So make sure that you understand what this init method does. Then we need to understand the difference between an instance and a class, right? So this is something I see beginners get confused about quite often. And it's really quite simple. The class you could view as just the blueprint of the house, and then the instance is the actual built house, right? So you can always think of it like that. But this is very important because it's a concept that applies in, again, not only Python programming, but object-oriented programming in general. So you need to understand this, and particularly the language that I'm using here, instance and the class. You need to understand that instance is a word that a lot of people use. Then inheritance is a very important concept in OOP, which basically allows us to inherit from existing classes and create new classes that then allows us to not have to rewrite all the functionality over and over and over. And this is probably one of the most important things when it comes to Django, because a lot of the classes that you use, that you import from Django, are built on, if not 5 or 6 or other classes that is inheriting from. So there's a whole chain of inheritance that goes on behind the scenes. And if you want to understand that and really, really understand it, you're going to need to understand inheritance. Then lastly are methods, right? So this could be instance methods, class methods. You need to understand what methods are. It's basically a function on the class, but it is executed related to that specific class. So it's very important to understand how methods are used and how they're executed, or called rather. But again, all of these concepts here that I've listed for classes, you'll find in one of the blog posts by Real Python, which is about object-oriented programming. So do read that article. If you're not familiar with anything that I just wrote here, you need to go and review classes, because if you don't understand any of this, Django is going to be a lot more difficult. So make sure that you understand this. And I would say that if you do, learning Django would almost be a breeze because you understand Python so well. On the same concept of classes, but a little bit more advanced, is the idea of the actual super function. Now the super function is something in Python that allows you to call a method that exists on the parent class. And if there's multiple parent classes, then it gets a little bit more complicated. But the super call or super function is also something very important to understand, because in Django, you use this super function to execute the parent logic. And you'll see an example of this later on that is really important to understand. Then lastly, it's the use of packages. So packages being third-party installed packages. This could be, for example, NumPy, Pandas, Matplotlib, any other sort of package that you install. If you're not familiar with working with packages, then working with Django will be a little bit tricky, because the whole thing of using third-party packages is that you import them into your working file, and you normally call some sort of function or create a class that inherits from something. You're working using the package that you installed, and it just creates a workflow that you get used to. You import something, you use that, and it gives you an output that you are looking for. Now in Django, there are a lot of modules that you can import from, and getting used to importing from those modules will take time. It sort of becomes memorization over time, but just being used to doing that, being used to importing something and not being confused as to why we need to import this and where does this come from and why is that imported like that. Those are Python issues that you need to work through, and you need to understand packages in general. And I would say that if you just work with something like NumPy or Pandas, just very basic packages, and these are actually libraries, which is something that I also want to touch on, which is the difference between a library versus a framework. So a library is something that you would import and you have control over. So you'd import it into your file, call some sort of function, and it would give you an output, and you are the one who's in control of everything. Whereas a framework is the other way around. The framework has control over what you write, and it decides when to sort of execute what you've written. So it's a very, very important difference between a library and a framework. And if you're used to working with libraries, then working inside a framework might be a little bit confusing in the beginning, because you wonder, when does your code get executed? But it's just a different mindset. You need to understand that a framework takes control of everything, and you are just slotting in or plugging in your code into a very specific part of in this case, the Django framework. But again, this falls under packages, so you need to understand packages in general. And I would say if you understand that and you understand classes, then you are well on your way to understand or to be very comfortable working inside Django. Now, just as an example, I'm going to create another file here. I'll just call it views.py. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to import something from Django. So let me just close all of this. So I'm going to say from Django, and I'm going to say from .views.generic. I'm going to import the template view, and I'm going to create my own example view, which is going to inherit from this template view. Now, the first thing again is the inheritance. So if you don't understand how classes inherit from each other, then this is going to make no sense, and you're just going to have trouble understanding Python as opposed to understanding Django. So there's the first part, inheritance. Make sure you understand that. Then there's a method particularly on this template view, which is the getContextData method. And this takes in self, first of all. So there's the self keyword, and then the keyword args argument. And this basically allows us to access many arguments that are passed into this function. Now what I'm doing is I'm overriding the method. So this method already exists, and I want to do something customized compared to what it already does. Now, I want to access the already existing context that's part of this view. And so the way that we do that is by using the super keyword, or the super function. So we call super, and we pass in our own class, and we pass in self. And when we call super, we are basically accessing in this case, the parent class, which is the template view, and we can call methods on that class. So I want to call getContextData, and what that takes in as an argument is this keyword args. So already, if this doesn't make sense, then you need to go and review super. You need to review all of these object-oriented programming concepts before continuing, because this is what you're going to do on a daily basis when you're working with Django. Now this is going to return context, and that context is a dictionary. So I can update this dictionary, and I can pass in whatever I want. I could pass in any data. So it could be a list of names, and that could be a list of Joe and soap. And then at the end of this, we just need to return this context. And so there's, again, a couple concepts being applied here. So we have the dictionary that is the context, right? So in Django, context is actually a dictionary. And I'm calling the .update method, as I mentioned earlier. And all I'm doing is updating it with my own data that I want to pass into this view. So there's already a couple concepts that you can see in this one example that require you to have a good Python knowledge, not even Django, not web development, just Python. So hopefully this example gives you an idea of what is required to understand when working with inside Django and when it comes to Python knowledge. And once again, check the links in the description of this video to see all of the tutorials to help you learn these concepts if you are struggling with them. And other than that, make sure that you subscribe, and I'll see you in another video.